Can everybody hear me? Okay. Cool. Well, thank you for being here this evening. Thank you to Elise for bringing me. I'm really happy to be here. So tonight we're going to talk about the work that I do, specifically my most recent project, which is titled At No Point in Between. I want to preface that in this presentation there are images of violence, and then there are descriptions of violence. So just giving you all a heads up. A crowd gathers. It was April 30th, 2001. I was a week away from turning 14. As I walked up the street, I noticed the crowd that had gathered. The yellow tape and the flashing lights. It was a moment where you think it's not happening to you. A sense of disbelief. I started to walk past the tape and an officer stopped me. That's my house, I tell him. I can still feel the pressure of his hand heavy on my chest. You can't go back there. He looks away and says something into his radio. My neighbor sees me from her porch and comes to get me. Let's go inside, she says. I can't. Won't move from where I'm standing. Robert's dead, she tells me. Bob stabbed him. The newspaper would print my mother's image and her words. He was cutting the grass. They kept calling him nigger. The wheel came off the lawnmower. He stopped to fix it. They kept drinking beer and calling him nigger. Bob, the neighbor, approached my mom. Nigger bitch, he spat in her face. I wonder, as the knife punched into Robert's chest, if he too felt the same sense of disbelief that I felt as I walked up the street and saw that gathered crowd. Did it feel the same to my mom as she begged Robert not to go back and fight? Did it feel the same to my brother as he watched, helpless? This isn't happening to you, but it very much is. For a long while, I look at the man at the center of the photograph, shirt starched in bright white behind the haze of smoke, the bend of his arm, fist resting on his hip, his smile that says, look at me. It's September 28th, 1919. Days prior, a white woman named Agnes Lobeck accused Will Brown, a black man, of raping her. He was arrested and held at the Douglas County Courthouse in downtown Omaha. As he awaited his trial, a crowd gathered. And with the malicious intent of protecting the preciousness of womanhood, the crowd demanded Brown's release. They lynched him, shot him, dragged his body through the streets of downtown Omaha, and eventually set it on fire. It was June 24th, 1969. A group of kids played music and dance in a vacant apartment. Vivian was there. The police arrived, and everyone makes a break for the back door. I wondered if, as Vivian picked up speed, before the bullet that would kill her was fired, if she had a moment of disbelief that she was going to get away. A crowd gathered there, and Vivian's sister broke through. She would first recognize Vivian's skirt, then her blouse. Then she would see that Vivian was shot in the back of the head. I sit on the couch in my living room. I'm 28 years old, 14 years after my 14th birthday. The lights are out and my face is lit by the glow of my cell phone. I watch in horror as Laquan McDonald's body spins and collapses in the street on the southwest side of Chicago. After the taping stops, a crowd gathers to collect evidence and begin getting the story straight. The police officer said that the boy with erratic eyes lunged with a knife in his hand, and that's why he pulled the trigger. 16 entrances, 16 exits, 24 wounds. In that video, I saw him not lunge. We all saw him not lunge. At the trial 3 years later, the boy's uncle would describe this as death by 1,000 cuts. As I stand in front of this condemned home, I know that a crowd will soon gather. This crowd, sent to tear this house down, will not acknowledge the depths of history that has played out inside of these four walls. Nor will they acknowledge that their gathering was set in motion by the construction of a freeway, the concrete structure that displaced hundreds of families that were forced to relocate, and because of that distance, when their grandparents passed, would not maintain the home. Many, if any of them, do not know of the red lines once drawn on a map that would lead to the building of the freeway and the exodus of people from this place. I'm interested in stories, not only the telling of stories, but figuring out where some stories connect. This work is made from stories that are not mine. It's important for me to acknowledge that. But at the same time, there are stories for many different reasons that I feel connected to, that I feel are important to be told and retold, to acknowledge and not forget. With this work, I started building an archive that wades into the many complications of photography's objectivity, an archive that seeks to merge our reading of social and physical landscapes, an archive that reinterprets complex narratives of race, power, and violence in America, that explores the intersections between historical structures of violence that have targeted Black individuals and communities in these United States, and how that structural violence is perpetrated. A little under a year after watching the video of Laquan McDonald's murder, I visited North Omaha. I wasn't intending to stumble into a 3+ year project. It was the first time since moving to Nebraska that I had entered an environment where everyone else looked like me. I was fascinated by this feeling. This was a place where my mere existence was positively acknowledged and confirmed without question. I passed through that first time, but made a promise to myself that I would go back and spend more time there. During my additional visits, I began to notice the rhythm of the landscape, its vacant lots, these gaps in time. To me, these vacant lots and condemned homes laid bare truncations in memory within the community. I had a desire to know more, to feel out those amputations. What I found was that these memories in this space existed in a way that we forget the actors in these repetitive modes of racialized terror, but not the terror itself. Through the stories of Will Brown and Vivian Strong, I found the implications of the term race riots and how our collective understanding of those words has shifted over time. In 1919, the term was categorized as white mobs attacking communities of color. In 1969, race riots were defined by oppressed people exercising their frustrations on their immediate surroundings. Both of these riots had profound effects on Omaha and its citizens, but the aftermath of the 1969 riots were the visual gaps I was witnessing in North Omaha in 2018. But it felt like there was something I wasn't grasping, something deeply embedded in the ground that I was standing on. In the United States, redlining is the process by which banks and other institutions refuse to offer mortgages or offer worse rates to customers in certain neighborhoods based on their racial and their ethnic composition. Redlining occurs when a lender or insurer targets neighborhoods that are predominantly non-white with the intent of making loans or insurance practically unaffordable. Beginning in the 1930s, the federal government sent assessors out to major metropolitan areas to assess the value of land. And the term redlining comes from the red boundaries drawn around those neighborhoods that were deemed less desirable because of large populations of people of color. And so this is a residential security map, one of the maps that was made in this assessment. And the area, the pink box in the middle with the D in it, that's North Omaha. So that's where I made most of this work. The underwriting manual, which was published by the Federal Housing Administration, was used by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, the assessors, to place value in land, and is explicit in how assessors could use racial makeup as a way to segregate. And so the excerpt on the slide reads, or a piece of it reads, if a neighborhood is to retain stability, it is necessary that property shall continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes. A change in social or racial occupancy generally leads to instability and a reduction in values. This government policy used to enforce segregation is a clear example of institutionalized racism in the United States. And today we are seeing one of the forms of redlining, gentrification, or the shifting demographics of neighborhoods through the influx of affluent residents and businesses. So we're seeing that today. But redlining is involved in that. And so, at one time, redlining promoted what's called white flight. And so the exodus of white people from inner city neighborhoods to suburbs. And now we're in the midst of what's called white return. And so that's, an influx of white individuals moving back into the inner city. And so, because neighborhoods that were redlined were given lower property values, they're now seen as prime real estate. And when neighborhoods gentrify, those who have lived there the longest, people of color, get forced out because they can no longer afford to live in those neighborhoods. I first came across the term slow violence when I was reading an essay in LaToya Ruby Frazier's book, The Notion of Family. And so for those of you who might not be familiar with her work, Frazier explores the erosion of her family through the lens of post-industrialization in her hometown of Braddock, Pennsylvania. And so when I was reading this essay in her book, and I found the source article where this term slow violence came from, and it was written by a sociologist named Rob Nixon. And so he begins the article by stating that to understand and address things such as climate change requires that we attempt to give symbolic shape and plot to formless threats whose fatal repercussions are dispersed across space and time. And so he goes on to then explain that we perceive violence in two distinct ways, fast and slow. And so fast violence is the violence that we all understand readily. Physical harm to the body, because we understand that as an immediate risk. And we have difficulty understanding concepts like redlining as a form of violence because of the vast gap between cause and effect. And so, through this research that I was doing, I had literally found the written language of redlining. But I'm out in the field and I'm photographing, and I had to search for the visual language of it. And that was really difficult because I was trying to define something that was, designed to be invisible. And that was probably one of the most difficult parts about making this work. But that realization forced me to begin looking at the landscape in a critical way, a way that I hadn't ever looked at a landscape before. And so I began to study architecture, topography, and infrastructure. And I started to be able to see these things in a different way. So in a lot of ways, this project for me was a meditation of sorts. I would drive to the neighborhood, I would park at various points, and I'd load up my camera and my film, and I would just begin walking with no real sense of direction. Sometimes I would follow light, wherever, the direction the interesting light might be in. I would listen for a particular hum of traffic and then just start walking towards it, or towards, populated places, places where there were a lot of people around. And through that process, this sort of visual mapping started to build, and that started to extend into what I began making photographs of. And so I was always looking for something that was maybe more meditative than descriptive. And so it was like, the work was like a study in nuance. And so I remember approaching this place. There's this building is like an old church that is closed down. And so I was actually across the street photographing that. And then I just decided to start walking over this way. And I remember getting to this point on the sidewalk on the other side of the street. And then I just stopped, and there was something that made me want to photograph this angle. And it wasn't really anything that I could define as descriptive. I photographed the front of the church to describe the church itself. And I thought that maybe might have, some sort of metaphorical weight. And then, as I was standing there and I felt the impulse to make something looking in this direction, I just told myself just to take a minute and look a little longer, to figure out what was creating this impulse for me to make this image. And it ended up being the paint on the stop sign. That's what I was looking at. I was looking at this moment where, somebody at some point was tasked with repainting this building, and they just were in such a rush that they painted the stop sign, and then the city never came to replace it or anything. So it was figuring that out for myself helped me begin to start to inject, or to search for those moments more consciously, and then trying to figure out how do I begin to build this body of work where a majority of the images start to function in that way, where I might give you something that seems immediate, but if you take the time with it and you sit with it and you kind of start to pick it apart, you might find these little surprises in there. But photographing here was really complicated, especially when engaging with the politics of beauty. I struggled with the state the neighborhood was in, why it was in that particular state, and then how its history, or how it has been perceived historically. North Omaha, when you live in Omaha, it's categorized as the hood or the ghetto. The McDonald's that's in the neighborhood that's across the street from the college campus, the college kids all refer to it as Crackdonald's. It has all of these sort of negative connotations that surround it. And so it's, I wanted to be really conscious of, the types of images that I was making here, and what I was sort of putting out into the world to represent this place. But it's easy to get lost in those conversations with oneself when you're making work, and things and because of that, they can start to become sort of stagnant, and you start to have like these circular conversations that don't lead you anywhere. But then I'd have these other moments that were really grounding, and that would help me get over those barriers. And so over the 3 years that I worked on this project, I photographed this house multiple times. And I didn't know what that impulse was until the last time I visited, and I think it was the chimney that was drawing me to it, because this house is kind of crumbling all around it, but the chimney is like pristine, it's still in perfect shape. And I think it was like this beacon of sorts, and this house served as an anchor. And so if I ever felt lost, or if I showed up to photograph and I was just having a rough day and couldn't find anything, I would just go back to this house, and I would sit there for a little bit, and I might photograph it. And one of the last times that I photographed it, there was a notice on the door that said the house was going to be torn down. And so I stole the notice. And with the notice, there was this pamphlet. And the language was really funny to me, like this question, what do I need to wreck a structure? And it got me thinking about sort of what the response would be based on who's being asked the question. So if it's somebody who legitimately wants to tear down their house, they can open the pamphlet and find all of the pertinent information inside. But when I read it, read it over and over, I thought well, what about me? What about this photographer who's trying to make work about redlining? And it got me thinking about the concept of structures. And I thought about the house as a structure. I thought about the family that once inhabited that house as a structure. The community that the family helped make up. I thought of that as a structure. And then I thought, what are the ways that all of those structures in this place have been wrecked? What caused that? What structure can I point to? And it's the freeway. And so I lived in Lincoln while I was making this work, which is about 30 minutes away from Omaha. And I got there by this structure. I traveled to this place on this structure. I was interacting with it every time I would, come here and leave to go home. I was interacting with it. I was using it. And freeways are a common narrative in the process of redlining. And so groundbreaking for the North Freeway happened in the 1960s, and it was built through North Omaha as a way to accommodate the city's population growth. And so the North Freeway was originally supposed to be routed through a majority white neighborhood, but was eventually built through North Omaha because of political protest. And so the families whose homes were destroyed, they were compensated by right-of-way laws, but it splintered the community. I think it was 6 city blocks wide, if I'm not mistaken, and the neighborhood suffered a 30% housing loss because of the construction of the freeway. And so if you think about all of those people who, that's where they were from. They were, living in, their childhood homes, and all of that disappears, and all of those people get displaced. And a lot of people decided to take that as an opportunity to move out of the neighborhood. And the freeway also created an economic stranglehold on the community. And so Lake Street is the main corridor that runs through North Omaha. It's commonly referred to as the Street of Dreams, or was referred to as the Street of Dreams. It was like all of the Black-owned businesses were there, the Black-owned newspaper, the jazz club, all of those things existed. But as soon as a freeway is built through, that corridor becomes less and less used because everyone's going to the freeway because it's more convenient. And so when it becomes less traveled, all of the business dries up. All of the businesses shut down. Poverty begins to rise, and then along with the rise of poverty comes the rise of crime. I had a desire to dismantle this structure, and I could do that metaphorically through, the clever juxtaposition of two photographs, but I also wondered what other imagery existed, and what conclusions that might lead me to. And so I began looking for the quintessential archival image of the North Freeway being built through North Omaha. And, I could only find anything that was taken on the ground, and I thought, well, there has to be like an aerial that I dug through. I dug through the entire archive that documented the building of the freeway. No aerial images. I couldn't find any aerial images. And so I just started kind of broadening my search and just kind of searching for this phenomenon, freeway being built through a Black neighborhood. And I came across this image, and so this is the aerial photograph that I was always looking for. But it's of a freeway being built through a Black neighborhood, like I said, in San Antonio. But it's a much clearer illustration, than the series of images, that I found in the archive specific to Omaha. But then also, I think it helped better inform the images that I had made myself. And that whole process to me was a lesson that I was so immersed in researching the history of this place that I had put blinders on, because there was all of this very rich material on the periphery for me to access. And so not only does this help me better visually communicate, the freeway's role in the context of this work, it also speaks to the ubiquity of redlining itself. I'm telling the story of this particular place, but the story is, in pretty much every major city across the United States has a similar history. And so I just started appropriating imagery. I again felt this sort of reluctance to break any of these rules. And I wanted to do that to make sure that I was honoring the reality of it by presenting it in this matter-of-fact way. But, I was boxing myself in, that I'm an artist, I break rules all the time. That's kind of my bread and butter. That's kind of my job. And so I started, I would find things that I thought were visually interesting, and then I would start to, manipulate and change them in different ways. And so that helped me expand my studio practice as an artist. And I started finding more and more of that emotional resonance that I had been searching for when I started making for the work. So, I just had to keep reminding myself, it's one thing for me to simply show you something, but maybe the question I should have been asking myself from the start was, how do I make you feel it? And, how do I speak on this violence in a way that makes us reflect upon ourselves and use that new site as a radical way of looking? And so my radical way of looking was found, I found it in photography's capacity to bend time, to simultaneously capture a past and present, and maybe point towards a future, and in its ability to build context and create complicating overlaps. And how those overlaps and intersections are important to grapple with, because as we have seen, images hold immense value. Their currency being that they can shape belief. Which brings us back to the start. And so, this video of the murder of Laquan McDonald, it was my first time ever watching a video like that, and it opened up a fear inside of me that I had never felt before. When I watched it, I thought about my mom for various reasons, but one that stuck out was because I learned fear through her. But the fundamental difference between those two types of fear is that the fear that I learned from my mom is based in love. And that's a fear that Black parents often have to instill in their children because it's necessary for us to have to recognize danger. And so I was thinking about that idea of love. And how do I put that into the work? And I feel like that's where the portraiture comes in. And it was the last part of the project that I worked on. And so, like those sort of early struggles when I was looking at the landscape and trying to figure out, like, what does it mean to make a beautiful image here? Is this image necessary for me to make? I felt that tenfold when I wanted to start making pictures of other people. Because of the really dicey and complicated history that photography has with representing people in a biased and unfair way. And so, a lot of the earlier versions of this work it was just all empty landscapes. And I always knew I would have to eventually photograph people, but I'm glad that I put it off for as long as I did, because when I first started the work, I didn't have an understanding of their community or who they were. And of course, it takes time to work up to that. It takes time to meet people. It takes time to talk with people. It takes time to get to a place where you can show up with a camera, and because you've been there for a while, and because you kind of know, you have a better sense of the place, I think people were more open to trusting me with making their images. And so my friend Lisa, she wrote an essay that's included in the book, and I'm just going to close out today by reading an excerpt from that. At moments, I tell you, these photographs crush me. The golden hush settling across the street. How when she turns her face to the light, she glows. Your sampling of history and the way silence speaks between. I want to call what I see beauty, but what I think I mean is love. Because it is a kind of love when a people who know observation can imperil say, I will let you look at me. And when you stand behind the camera and say, I see you. A love in seeing someone else's eyes that red lines were one of the many lies told to fix the image, and that Black people have always written around them and through them and all over the top. In the beginning, you and I were born into this place. Ours is a country that would force you to see your outlines in the body of a boy shot to death on Chicago's Southwest Side, and absolve me from recognizing mine in the lyncher's smile. That blindness means that I struggle to find language to tell the story while you speak it in registers. I won't lie to you. There's a part of me when I look at the woman with dark skin and pink lips and arms thick like mine that wants to ask her for a forgiveness she does not owe me. Give me a chorus to repeat so I don't have to articulate my own reckoning. She looks back at me, but remains silent. In the end, the defense tried its best to use the mother's words against her son. She refused to speak. When I go looking, the photograph I find is of the boy smiling shy beneath a red mortarboard, a long hand not yet grown into holding a rolled diploma. I envision the family, wrung out from knowing that too many strangers watch their boy take his last breath, sifting through the snapshots to find the one that delivers his memory. Behold, this you can have of him. The rest we will keep. Thank you.